to open for karakia. I'll ask Kiniwa if she would lead us for the start of the day.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa. We'll start with our karakia whakataka te hau. So in time with me. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hia ki ana te ātakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, si hei mauri ora. Cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red tip dawn come with a sharpened ear, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. Kia ora.
Okay. Any notices? To be done. Apologies. I think we've got a full complement. Conflict of interest declarations. Any of those? There are none. Minor items for business not on the agenda. Okay, let's get to item 4 then. Confirmation Environment Integrated Catchments Committee, term of reference. I take it everybody's read the papers. Does everybody need to do an introduction to this from the executive team?
No, I don't think so, Chair. We've just reflected the previous discussions in the paper and now seek to have them either adopted or adopted as amended following further discussion.
Okay, any questions about the terms of reference? I thought it was pretty straightforward to me.
Mr. Chairman, I just had a thought that given the term environment, or the word environment is the first in the name of this committee, that the terms of reference as to environment are a little bit narrow in terms of monitoring strategies and technical reports. And I did wonder if a broader policy approach would be appropriate within that, along the lines of to consider and recommend to Council policy regarding all environmental aspects of long-term plan implementation. The paper we've got today on Right Tree, Right Place touches on implementation regarding the erosion control scheme, and this might be the committee at which we discuss and adopt or recommend a broader environmental policy approach to issues that the long-term plan addresses in an environmental context. So that's just a thought, just to sort of broaden that out a little bit.
Could I draw your attention to, thank you Councillor Williams, draw your attention to 1.4?
Yes.
Carbon reduction, climate change, adaptation and mitigation policies. So we to consider all policies relating to carbon reduction, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, strategies, etc. I thought that was a pretty broad remit.
Chair,
wouldn't cover water or biodiversity, for example.
So quite deliberately, Chair, could I perhaps just explain the items listed under 1.1 to 1.4 under policy have been relatively narrowly constructed to avoid the responsibilities of the Regional Planning Committee. Once you get into 2 around environmental monitoring research, that's a broader focus on the environment, but activity-wise it's anchored to monitoring and research. So we've tried to navigate the reasonably broad remit for policy development under the RMA for the Regional Planning Committee that does cover a broad range of environmental matters, and try to carve the space of this committee. And it is quite difficult to do. So that's the reason why it's as prescriptive as it is, and why I would suggest that the proposed wording from Councillor Williams would be problematic with respect to the Regional Planning Committee.
And I take that on board, James. Just 2 thoughts about that. One, there is obviously the issue about the interface of the 2 committees that we're dealing with now. One is a representative of regional planning on here. The type of policy I'm talking about wouldn't just be resource management policy. Right Tree, Right Farm is not resource, it's not an RMA, it's an environmental policy, biodiversity strategy, all that sort of stuff. It's much broader than planning. So I'm not going to die in the ditch about it. It's just a suggestion that this is a bit technical.
Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a comment to Martin in terms of the division of, if you like, responsibilities or focus. the Corporate and Strategic Committee does take, there's the opportunity there in terms of the long-term plan to go through those issues. So it becomes, if you like, a semantic judgment call whether we place responsibility in the Environment Committee or Corporate and Strategic. Either way, they're both covered, in my view. So the opportunity is not lost to engage on those issues at a committee level through Corporate and Strategic out in the long-term plan process.
Well, for my part, I thought having environment in the heading gave you a pretty broad remit, and given what committees in the past in this council have done with virtually no policy position, have roamed and far and wide, I would have thought we've got plenty of scope to do whatever we want to in this committee.
Yeah. I've made my point. I don't want to push it. The delegations that we have under the Act do confine us to our terms of reference. They are important. We can't commission reports on matters that are outside the terms of reference. I just thought
Well,
I'm not going to belabor it anymore. I've made a suggestion. It's not finding.
Okay.
Fertile
All right. Well, we find we've got a problem. We'll overcome it. Okay. So the only thing I'd say, reflecting on that, what the point that Martin's made is that when it looks like policy, we're more interested in flood protection than we are in climate change. So I was wondering if it would be possible to make the order shift 1.4 to the top is a key thing.
So Chair, that would be fine. I guess it reflects the fact that flood protection has its own statutory basis, whereas climate change at the moment is embedded within other legislation, at least with respect to regional councils' functions. Can I just also make the comment that, just to draw Councillor Williams' attention to 3.2, I do think that's reasonably broad in terms of recommending to council management plans or similar documents for effective implementation of environmental enhancement or improvement programs of council. That's a fairly broad remit for things like right tree, right place.
And we've got biodiversity in 3.3. Right, would someone move the...
Sorry, that's one further question.
Councillor Foss, sure.
Sorry, Mr Chair, just 3.3, just following on from that. Just expand slightly on the bit where this committee recommends and investigates the way infrastructure assets should be constructed, existing open space, regional parks, and infrastructure asset construction or improvement work. Is that's delivery very wide, or is that just specifically limited to, say, flood protection or something, or could this be water storage facilities, or what? How wide does that go?
Look, it could be water storage facilities. I think it's look, the general focus of this committee is operational as opposed to strategic, which is the corporate and strategic functions, which is at that higher level, and within our asset mix, everything from the Waipatiki campground through to our cycleways, including, as it says here, the regional parks, but pumping stations and all the like would all come under that. So
well, I understand that. So it's just generally accepted that, because they couldn't have these discussions without thinking about some kind of financing or something like that. But the material consideration of how things are financed, etc., lie with corporate and strategic and the finance group.
Yes, so I think when we're talking about funding mechanisms here, we would be particularly talking about the specifics of a targeted rate or a cost recovery mechanism, but that would have to be considered, excuse me, in the round with the overall budgeting of council at corporate and strategic.
So should we just leave that on the table, or do we need to note that somewhere?
Look, from my perspective, I think what we try to ensure is that across all of the council committees, there's nothing that falls between the cracks, if you like, and there's coverage. As a consequence of that, and just the nature of the business, is that there is a bit of overlap at the margins of each of the committees, and I think in practice we just work our way through that. So I think it's satisfactory in terms of coverage.
Thanks.
Just to respond to Councillor Foss again, the other difference here is we don't have two separate committees which have no crossover of personalities. So you need to be more careful. If it was a committee doing this and there was no interconnection between the other, yes, you would need to do that. So you're not making decisions here which affect another committee. We're all on the same committee, so we all come out at the same time. So whatever we're doing in one committee, we're very mindful of what needs to be done in the other. So there's less care required about that, in my view.
Thanks.
All right, would someone care to move the that the policy, terms of reference be agreed to, was subject to the reordering of 3.
I'll move.
Sheriff, seconder. Anyway, would you like to speak?
Yeah, just the suggestion you made to change 1.1 to 1.4.
Yes.
That is not what we're voting on. We're staying it is as it is, correct?
No, we're changing it. I've asked you to move a resolution issue 1.4 to 1.1.
Not sure whether I support that.
All right, well.
Then I will withdraw my.
Mr. Chair.
Councillor Curtin. Right. Anyway, are you still happy to second?
Yes.
Okay. Councillor Curtin. Anyway?
No, I'm happy with that. I think it sits there. They're all very important under one, so
Like to
where they
speak?
sit doesn't matter.
Yeah, I can't see why we actually need to make that change. To me, actually, drainage is actually a very, in the Hiratonga Plains, is actually a very important activity. It is livelihoods of people, but also lives can be lost if the drainage is not actually done properly. And I've had meetings with the team that get involved in this, and they always feel that they're actually the poorer cousin within the Hawkesbury Regional Council, those who actually have to work on flood protection, because they are being given certain objectives to reach, and often they go against what we say the environment. So riparian planting, when you do riparian planting and you do drainage and maintain those drains, it is always a very difficult discussion, and I feel by us pushing them down to number 4, we actually given them even more the feeling that actually what they're doing is actually against everybody else within the community. So I just know that is their main focus, and they're doing a fantastic job, and I wouldn't want to minimise that. So that's all I would like to say about it.
Well, does anybody else want to speak? Councillor Graham.
I'll speak to that. I think it's right to have climate change as the overarching priority for this council for the entire Ruhi, and that's what this does. I'd like to speak to Jerem's point, re-drainage. It is the great contradiction in the regional council, which sort of morphed out of the catchment board, between ensuring we have adequate flows in our rivers, creeks and streams to get water off the Hiratonga Plains, which is the heartbeat of certainly of Hiratonga, against protecting our streams from heat and silt. And I do think we are finally getting to a point where we are finding that common ground. We have an outstanding person driving it, and I just want to reassure Jerif that he doesn't give an inch when it comes to ensuring that he has the capacity, and this council has the capacity to keep floodwaters flowing. Not an inch. Because I've had battles on the side with him myself.
Anybody else? I'll just speak briefly to add to what Councillor Graham has said. I think we regard climate change as the most important issue facing the world today, and it's going to affect all of us. So it is right that it should be at the top. By pushing stop banks to number 4, we're not saying that it's unimportant or less important. What we're saying is that the climate change is the most important thing for us. And as the Chief Executive noted, which is correct, stop banks and all those other people have their own piece of statute. So it's a very clear, a very powerful mandate to do their work, and we cannot diminish that. All right. You want to sum up?
No,
I'll put the question. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Carried. Okay, next item. That's the Pandora Pond.
Thank you, Chair. So look, I'll invite and introduce two staff to you. Anna Madaras-Smith, who's our Principal Scientist Coast, and Jeff, are you going to join Anna as well? Introduce Jeff Smith, who's our Manager Science. This paper is one that was requested by the previous Environment and Services Committee members some months ago, and Anna has pulled together a presentation to accompany the report, so I'll hand over to you, she'll run you through it, and then I'm sure she'll take questions.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Anna Madaras-Smith tōku ingoa, ko te putaio o ngā tiniatanga roa, te konihera rohi o te mātua Māui. For those who I haven't met, my name's Anna Madaras-Smith and I'm the Principal Scientist for the Marine and Coast team here at Regional Council. Today I'm just going to have a quick chat to you about Pandora Pond water quality, and this presentation comes following a presentation I did to the Environment and Services Committee in July of last year. And essentially it was stemmed out of some exceedances of our recreational water quality monitoring guidelines. So firstly, just want to take the opportunity to run through a bit of the background, because I know there are some new members here at Council, and also just confirm the area that we're actually talking about. So Pandora Pond is part of the Ahuriri Estuary, but it is specifically this little nook here that sits on Humber Street. It's a really popular recreational area, basically due to the fact that on such a high exposed coastline like Hawke's Bay, it's a safe area for young families, for people to undergo recreational activities. Huge public usage. Anyone who's been down this area in the heat of summer, you can get up to, thousands of people in triathlons as well. So very, very high recreational usage. We get swimming, we get wakaama, we get kayaking, paddle boarding, all sorts of activities. Opti-yachting for young children. The Optimist Yachting Trust runs out of here. And in the 2017 to 18 season, we saw quite a high number of exceedances of our national guidelines for recreational water quality. That stemmed some further research, and this continued again in 2018 and 2019. And so just come before you today to present some of the updated information we've got, and to talk about whether or not this represents a change in water quality in the pond. A little bit of history to the pond. So the area of the pond up to the low-level bridge, which is further west of the expressway and railway bridge, is actually a gazetted wildlife refuge. So all of that means is that it is protected from disturbance to the wildlife. It was the pond itself, that little nook, was created in 1977 when the port decided it needed to expand and reclaim some area, and it used the fill from that area to actually expand the port.
Chair, can we ask questions per slide?
I'm fine.
Yeah, all right. You'd like a question?
Yeah, I'm really interested in gazetted wildlife refuge. Does that mean we can't cull introduced species?
It does. It does. Now, I'd have to double check with, actually, you might be. It does within that area, but I think you can cull them outside of the area.
Just by the airport there then?
So it's the area from the bridge that goes from...
Do you have a look at the map?
Yep. So it's the area from the bridge that goes between the inner harbour and the Ahuriri Estuary. So this is West Shore, Meani Road. So it's all this area, all the way up the outfall channel to the low-level bridge, and it includes these areas of the Northern Pond and West Shore Lagoon.
All those Canadian geese, they're safe?
Well, actually, I think Canadian geese got taken out of the...
No.
No? Or is it...
Canadian geese are no longer a game bird under the Conservation or Wildlife Act, but...
There's Canadian geese in there.
Yeah, but given that it's a wildlife refuge, you can't turn up and cull them in the area, is the point.
That's my point.
Outside of the area, absolutely, you can do it.
But right there, you can't.
Breeding like rabbits. Won't see the water shortly. Canadian geese. Right, keep going.
Yep, so Canadian geese, I've observed quite a few up in this area. I haven't really seen that many around this area here. It's more your typical for your wading birds and your gulls. As I mentioned, family friendly, it's nice, it's sheltered, it's not that high exposed coastline that we're used to. But there are a number of issues in terms of the surrounding land use. We've got the Pandora industrial estate, or the Thames Tyne industrial estate, and historically that's contributed quite high levels of contaminants into the estuary. 70% of Napier's stormwater transits into the estuary around the railway bridge and the expressway, and of course we've got all the area on the western side, which is predominantly in sheep and beef. And over the years, particularly in the 80s and 90s, there's numerous reports looking at the water quality of the estuary, and more recently, 2014, a report on the contact recreation and food gathering, and also estuaries of the tank catchment to support the tank plan change. So just a quick run through of what our recreational water quality program is and how we establish whether a site is safe for recreation. This is driven by the Ministry of Health and Ministry for Guidelines, microbiological water quality guidelines for freshwater and marine recreation areas, and it's based on how much fecal indicator bacteria are in the water. So it doesn't look at anything else, it doesn't look at rips, currents, visibility, it just looks at feces in the water as opposed to things like trace metals and anything else that can make a water body unsuitable for swimming. Pandora Pond has been monitored since 1995 under this program, and we look for not the pathogens that can make people sick, but indicators that they are there. And what it is people have had a look at the incidence between these fecal indicator bacteria and public health illness, and been able to correlate a level at which they think it's safe for swimming and a level at which they suggest not swimming in the area. The indicators we use are E. coli, Escherichia coli, in freshwater and enterococci in marine waters. The reason they're different is their persistence in the different water bodies corresponds to the public health risk. So in freshwater, E. coli, which is specific to mammalian guts, is the highest correlation between that and illness like acute febrile respiratory illness, gastrointestinal illness, skin irritations, eye irritations. And enterococci in the marine waters, because E. coli is deactivated by salinity. So you basically get a less conservative reading. So enterococci is the indicator we use in marine waters. Now, one of the problems is that enterococci is not specific to fecal material. It can come from vegetative strains as well. So
sorry, the fecal matter, do you disseminate that further by animal, human, bird or something?
I will be coming to that.
Oh, okay.
So every week one of our technicians goes out, takes a water sample, it goes directly to the lab, they plate it on this agar, and as you can see what we measure are these coliform forming units, and that's what we compare to national guidelines. So here you'd see 2 coliform forming units, that's under the guidelines, however many are here, 19 let's say, and then it goes up and up until you've got lots. And for the national guidelines, for E. coli, it's a number at 550, and for enterococci, it's 280. What we have is the traffic light system of representing results. So when the traffic light is green and it's underneath that green level, it's considered safe for swimming. There still is a risk of illness, but that risk is deemed acceptable, and it's about a 2% risk of illness. In amber, it's still deemed acceptable. There's no specific risk factor there, but it's elevated, and that prompts councils to go and have a look and just see if there's anything visible that's going on. And at the red traffic light, the risk of illness is deemed unacceptable, and that's when you'll find things like the Public Health Unit will put out a media release saying don't swim in the area, the local councils may put out signage. So the results go to the Public Health Unit. The Public Health Unit will then instruct TAs to undertake signage or sanitary surveys. We also have the system now of LAWA with a Can I Swim Here module, and that goes automatically through to LAWA, so it's updated by about Wednesday of each week, and that offers a nationwide perspective on these things. So, what are we seeing? So for E. coli, which is that freshwater indicator, because in brackish waters like the Pandora Pond, we use the 2 indicators. Now it is actually more marine than it is brackish. It's highly saline. So we did swap to enterococci for a period here where there's some missing data, but what we've basically seen, and this represents a little outlier which is somewhere up here, and you lose your perspective of the graph if we include it. So you can see that historically there's been very, very low levels, very few exceedances in this elevated but still considered safe for swimming, and none in this unsafe for swimming. 2017 to 18, 2018 to 19, you can see that we get actually a high number of those exceedances. And out of the 263 times it was sampled over this period, very, very high compliance until you get to this period here. 89% of those exceedances were in those 2 seasons. So something is definitely going on in terms of the E. coli.
Anna, was there any increase in the monitoring frequency between 2017 and 19?
For this one, yes, there is. For our state of the environment, we only use, very good question, we only use the core state numbers, which is our weekly sampling, and it still shows the same data.
So just to clarify that, in lieu of James' question, we're comparing apples with apples when we see that elevated rise?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you go back a slide, please?
So there is a higher frequency in this area because I've included all the data from our studies, our investigations, but we've also just completed our recreational water quality monitoring state of the environment 5-yearly report, which doesn't include those investigations, and we see the same trend for E. coli. Might not be the same as an 89% of exceedances, but we're certainly seeing an increasing trend within that 2-year period.
One more question. In terms of the rationale for when the testing's done, is it random, or have we more recently tested after events when we're more likely to see
So for the state of the environment monitoring, it is weekly, Monday, exactly the same time, has been for numerous years. For including those investigations, we certainly do, and later in the presentation I'll go through some of the other data we've been trying to capture as well. But we try to target things like rainfall, we try to target things like when there's a number of people there, they may be stirring up sediment, because what we're trying to get in terms of the investigation, in terms of our understanding, is what are the factors that we might be able to predict when these exceedances are high, so that we can warn public prior to it happening. One of the things we use is rainfall, and that's used throughout the country in terms of a bit of a flag. So we say stay out of the water 2 to 3 days following a heavy rain. Heavy rain's typically 8 to 10 millimetres, and what I like to say is if you see rain in the gutters, wandering around the gutters, then it's likely to be heading into your local waterway. So that's when you know, well, need to be a bit careful. Same thing with just checking the water. Is it dirty? Is it brown? You want to go somewhere else.
Question. When you say 89%, I'm just trying to get what the 89 is. So is it 89 of all things you've been monitoring since 1993?
No.
The figure doesn't make any sense
Of
to
the
me.
exceedances, only one of the exceedances occurred outside of that, and the rest of them occurred in that 2-year period.
8 out of the 9 occurred in that period.
So when people say to me, has the water quality changed? I can only go back to our sampling in previous years, and I've said, well, actually the sampling in previous years has been pretty good. We don't have that many exceedances. Come into 2018, and there were a number of exceedances happening.
I'm just trying to get the timeline to 2017, 2019. What's the base? Is it the whole period of 89% of all exceedances have occurred over all of the period of time? So from when?
Yes, over all the period of time,
Okay.
8 out of the 9.
February
So there's 9
93.
exceedances over
93.
a whole period, and 8 of them occurred in that period.
So do you have an idea of why there's been a sudden spike?
She's just going to get to that.
I plan these to take you on a story.
Having a shocker.
He's having a shocker, Chair.
Just trying to look at sort of the information we use to make these sort of assessments. And so we've looked at a number of monitoring periods because of that little gap in the middle that can skew some of the statistics. So we've looked at a number of monitoring periods, and there's a few things going on here. When we look at the whole data set, or the data set from 2000, we'd see definitely an increasing trend in that E. coli. And that's no shocker. You saw those number of exceedances in 2017-18. That's absolutely driving that up. When we look at 2009 to 19, there is no trend, but that's a little bit of a cautionary tale because we don't have that data through there. So that's being skewed by that. The one thing that I'm going to just highlight here is this measure of this 95th percentile, going back to 7 form statistics. It basically means that when you lay all your data out on a line from smallest to highest and put it in the 95th, what does that number represent? And you can see that when we're looking at this data, it's 342, it's above the guidelines, but it's the 95th percentile, which is the highest part above the guidelines, and then it jumps right up. So when we're talking about the exceedances, they are quite high and they're quite frequent. The magnitude is quite high. When we look at enterococci, again, we use the dual indicators because it's marine waters. Enterococci is the one that, according to the guidelines, should be used in marine waters, so we've got that period there. However, it is not fecally specific, and technically, given that E. coli is less persistent in saline waters, we should see higher enterococci and lower E. coli. But what we can see here is that there are a few exceedances historically, and again they are increasing in this period here. There is a very, very high one again right off, but it's not as obvious as the E. coli. And again, just looking at those different time periods, there's no trend in the enterococci. This is slightly different to the state of the environment, which says that there's a slightly decreasing trend or improving water quality for enterococci, but that's based on the state versus the investigation sites as well. What do we find? So, a quick introduction, fecal source tracking is something we do when we do find elevated levels of bacteria. It is very difficult to obtain a fecal source sample that will give us data. There has to be certain circumstances met. The bacterial levels have to be high. It shouldn't be influenced by rain, otherwise we've found that you get a very inconclusive test result and they're $1,000 a pop. So we need to make sure that we are trying to get the best result we can at the time. The other thing is we are aware that during wet weather, you tend to get a lot of aged fecal sources coming in off the land, and it means that the DNA that we use to track these species is no longer active and we can't find exactly what it is. So you spend quite a bit of money and don't get a particularly good result. It just means that we don't have as many samples. If we could go out and sample tomorrow for the next 5 days and pinpoint the culprit, it would be much easier, but unfortunately we have to use certain circumstances to meet those requirements for fecal source tracking. When we first had issues with the pond, the Napier City Council inflatable was still up, and we were finding that there was scum formulating around that inflatable. And when we tested that particular scum off the surface, it came back highlighting bird sources as the fecal matter. We've also done other tests, and in the Thames Tyne catchment, which is coming out of that the Pandora industrial estate area, we have had positive fecal source tracking for both cow and sheep feces, and at the rail bridge we have also had ruminant, which is cow, sheep, deer. It just doesn't go down specifically narrow enough. So we are finding a number of sources. We have not found human sources in the Pandora pond or wider estuary, although coming out from the Thames Tyne there was a inconclusive result that could potentially have been from human sources.
Can I just pick you up there in terms of those discharges by Napier City from their wastewater system in bad weather? Where are those samples taken? So
which samples? The fecal source tracking?
Fecal source tracking. When samples were taken from the Napier City Council discharges, where were they taken from?
So we wouldn't do fecal source tracking when Napier City Council is discharging, because we know that there will be human feces recorded in the water.
Sure. So during those events, where was sampling taken?
So we, as a science team, we don't sample. Compliance will sample, and my understanding was that Napier City undertook the last sampling as part of the discharge.
Where from? Do you know?
All over, I think.
all
Right
over?
round the estuary.
Right round the
Yeah.
estuary.
I know that they did do some in the higher estuary as well, to be able to contextualise what the results were meaning.
Cool. In terms of the Thames Tyne discharge, stormwater discharge, you found remnants of cow feces. Is that is that mainly from, say, the tanneries, so the activity that's happening in the industrial area, or from the surrounding farmland?
It's a very good question. You can't define it down as to a certain locale unless you do it in a systematic way up the stream. And as I said, trying to get those samples in themselves is difficult enough. There's not a lot of farmland around there, and when there is, there's not a lot of stock on there.
So we can assume it's from the industrial activity?
I would assume so, and Napier City Council, they get all of these results as well, and they're being really active in that area at the moment, trying to source any kind of discharges that are not compliant.
My understanding there's a very small rural catchment feeding into that waterway.
That's true.
Beyond.
That's right, because actually where you find stock sort of opposite Maitanega fishing and hunting, actually drains through the Tutakuri riverbed rather than necessarily into the top of the Thames.
So it could be either?
Yeah, I would still say that it's there's very few stock within that drainage area. We did test also for horse, because there are horses kept in that area, and we didn't find any horse material.
No horse shit there.
Next slide.
Okay, so what are we doing with all this information? So when we kept seeing those exceedances coming up, again, the key question is, firstly, where are they coming from, and how can we manage it? Can we manage it? The other is, how do we let people know in a timely way when the water quality may not be that great? And we can do that when it's raining, but in dry weather it's almost impossible unless you use a modelled approach or a surrogate that can be recorded and dealt with in a timely manner. The other thing that so this comes to the Collie-Minder study, which I'll update you on next, and the other is continuing to do the faecal source tracking when we can, to try and further pinpoint what those sources are under what conditions. Other areas that we're doing, obviously there are consents currently in process for Napier City Council, Pāmu, and Napier City Council, Hawke's Bay Regional Council and Pāmu. We're continuing the enhancement and restoration work through the Ahuriri hotspot, and we keep a working relationship with Napier City Council, who are very active in that Thames Tyne area. The one thing I will note is, when we talk about success, and we mentioned this in the past with the gazetted wildlife, the ability to swim is not the measure of success we need to be going from. It's the ability to not find any other faecal material except for bird faeces. The reason being, the point of the estuary being a gazetted wildlife area is for the security and safety and habitat for those bird species. So it is possible that over time, we may actually see increases in faecal material originating from birds. But a success for me would be that we don't see any sheep, we don't see any cow, we don't see ruminant.
And just another question. How would you characterise a faecal bacteria indicator problem in ecological health terms? In other words, is this a measure of swimmability, or is this a problem for the ecological health of the estuary?
So typically, faecal indicator bacteria, they don't really care. Other species don't care. They see it as a food. It's just part of the food web. The issue would come from the things that are associated with the faecal indicator bacteria. So if it's coming from a stormwater system, a grey water system or a black water system, it's the nitrogen, it's the organic loading, that sort of thing, that is more of an issue for ecological health. But the faeces itself is a nutrient, it's part of a system that can be broken down and consumed and passed through.
Thank you.
So the Collie-Minder study, this came up again when we talked about having these exceedances which were not predetermined by weather, and we were position where people were swimming and we don't know. The traditional method, whereas if we take a water sample and they grow it on that plate, it actually takes 24 hours for that bacteria to incubate to a point that we can actually have a result. So it's at least 24 hours until we can say, hey, when you swam there 2 days ago, the water was actually exceeding recreational guidelines. So what we did is we worked with NIWA to trial this little machine here, which is a collie minder. And essentially it just looks at the enzyme activity of bacteria, specific bacteria, and can give you a result in 15 minutes. And it's been used in drinking water supplies internationally, and it's been used in Pandora, and they've been able to build a correlation around it that says when the units put out by this machine are this, it means that you're probably in this sort of level for swimming. So the grand hope for that would have been that you could have it deployed as a buoy out here, it would suck up a water sample, process the water sample and highlight a thing within maybe 15 to 20 minutes to be able to show water quality changes. Unfortunately it didn't. So we took 732 measurements and 225 of those were in the pond themselves, the rest were in the wider Ahuriri estuary. What we would have hoped, if we were able to use it, is that these dots here would have sat very nicely along this, you know, maybe some scatter, but generally along these axes. And that would have meant that we could have gone, okay, well at 280 we're looking at a collie minder result of X, so we know when to turn the light red. But it really didn't do that at all. In fact, one of the main constraints to us getting information from the system is we actually had very few exceedances of the recreational guidelines. In the 5 months that we were testing and the 225 samples that we did in the pond, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly 5, 6, 7 exceedances. So, yeah.
That's fine.
So there's very little pattern. We can actually take the data back to NIWA and have them look at it in more depth, so use some data mining, use some AI to actually look at the data and see whether maybe it's a 1.5 times the turbidity times the, you know. But the good news story is we also haven't had any exceedances so far this season. So we'll just keep a watching brief on it. We'll continue to monitor through the recreational water quality and continue to take our fecal source samples.
Could you just, your paper puzzles me a little bit. This. So go back to your slide, please. Inconclusive, no pattern. So
For the collie minder study.
So what are you trying to tell us with this?
It was an update because we'd come to the council talking about the collie minder and what our aims for it were. So we've done the study. We aren't able to use it at this point to further progress those dry weather exceedances and alerting the public to when it is.
So at the moment we're in a situation where the public health warnings effectively come out after the event. And because of the time it takes to grow the bacteria in the lab.
Sure, yeah, okay.
And so the collie minder is a $100,000 piece of kit that we thought might be worth buying off NIWA, or buying our own kit, so that we could provide real-time advice. And I guess what Anna's saying is the business case for that doesn't stack up right now.
All right, that's better. So it's not doing what we thought we would. It's not going to give us what we thought we wanted.
That's it.
All right.
How unusual is that?
Okay, Craig.
Could you please just briefly, the status right in 1958 when it was declared a wildlife refuge, part 1, and then part 2 is, I recall when the new roundabout for the airport, etc. was made, there were a lot of terms and conditions that TA, Napier City Council had to adhere to, and in around that reserve. So A, is it the same reserve? And so therefore, what other regulatory authorities are you engaging with here who may be using your data, have pitched in some of the tin for this 100k toy, or what? If you just go to a bit more depth there, please.
Okay, so firstly going to the 1958 question with the gazetted wildlife, remembering that Ahuriri Estuary Te Whanganui Orotu was a massive marine lagoon pre the 1931 earthquake. Post-earthquake, a lot of rubble, the old buildings went into it, a lot of concrete. In about the 50s, this area through the Thames Tyne Industrial Estate was actually discharging some fairly nasty stuff so the water quality would have been very poor. However, the overall quality of the habitat for particularly migratory bird species is exceptional, particularly close to a major centre. In 1992 they actually had a Ramsar review of it, and it could meet the Ramsar criteria.
But who has legal
Department
last
of
person
Conservation.
stand? Yeah, it's DOC,
Yes.
exactly. So how does that fit with where you're going? Are they out there with you? Are they pitching in? Are they?
Absolutely. So DOC look at the wildlife status. We look at the discharges into that. So water quality, etc. That's our role in the scheme of things, and we do that with the TAs working in it. When you talk about other agencies, the Watchman Roundabout is up here, and certainly they were very active in this space, particularly making scrape lakes, etc. down this end, which were very successful as a compensation for widening that berth and taking some of the area out of that gazetted lagoon. Napier City has responsibility for these areas here as well as the reserves, and Napier City actually own half the outfall channel and Department of Conservation own the other half, so it's a very strange set up in terms of the legal rights, but the Department of Conservation under their Conservation Act have their specific mandates in the area. We have ours in terms of discharges into the area and the management.
So they're clearly understood lines of, there may be some greyness there as you've just described, but everyone's getting on with the job. There's no, it's their problem, not our problem, Napier versus regional versus DOC or anything like that.
I don't believe so.
So Councillor, I could just add to that in very recent times we've engaged with the executive of the City Council to start thinking about how we might pull together a little more integration and coordination of our activities, not just between ourselves but across Department of Conservation and others. And as you'll appreciate, with an integrated catchments approach, we're looking to try and not only do our work effectively and efficiently as a business, but also make sure that we're, as you say, partnering with and coordinating our activities with others, so we don't bump into each other or inadvertently conflict in terms of our outcomes. We would like to develop a bit of a plan or a roadmap on how we will do that and lay it out. We haven't been able to do that to date because we've been trying to work through to committee that sits across the estuary. Mana Ahuriri is the settlement entity being the driver of that. What we've agreed to do is say, look, we'll just bring together an operational plan that lays out how the various parties will work together at an operational level, and we're not going to call it an integrated catchment plan or strategy. So we're doing that work now, and in time we'll be able to bring that back to you to say, look, really clearly this is how we mesh together and how we work. The other point I'd just make is that we need to be mindful that in our pursuit or our ambition to restore, protect, enhance the environment here in this estuary, obviously a bit of interest in the wildlife refuge aspect of it. In time this place will be chocker full of birds, because actually that's success, because we've got the habitat right. So we are going to run into some conflict potentially with the idea of recreational use of the area and wildlife values. In aviation. So there's a whole lot of sort of competing agendas here that we're trying to rationalise and bring together. But the reality is that, if we have lots of birds there, we may have poor water quality at times because of it.
Neil?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you could allow indulge me in three questions, and just for the sake of my new colleagues around the table, if I can take you to paragraph 3 of the paper. The science program is run by the Integrated Catchment Management Group, and I just wonder whether you could help us, Anna, just for my colleagues. Anna is a very important person around this table, probably the most important person, given her oversight of 30% of the region's environment, and I just want to make sure everyone knows how this works. So we've got Ian Maxwell is the Integrated Catchment Management Group Manager, is that correct? Now Dr. Smith is the Manager Science, and Anna reports to Dr. Smith, is that correct? So that's how that chain of command works. But again, I state that the most important person in it is Anna.
Right, we'll concur.
Can I go?
Have the drum roll now.
Can I go now? Can I go now? There's second question.
That wasn't a question, as a statement.
There was a question in there.
Oh.
I asked if it was
having a
correct.
shot
I
at
asked
you.
if it was correct. Anna, I just want to go to the next question is around the definition of water quality, and it was a good question from Councillor Williams in terms of ecological health. What we've dealt with is a singular, if you like, E. coli examination. Can you talk to us about the balance and the more important ecological issues? You talked about the organic loading, sedimentation, etc., the impacts in that zone, and if I can ask you what other examinations of, say, the benthic qualities, etc., of the estuary, of the Pandora pond itself, and then I'll come to a third question. If you could go through the balance of water quality issues you're looking at.
Right. So within the Pandora pond itself, there are no outlet of discharges. There may be one or two small discharges from this area here. We really only look at that fecal indicator bacteria. The benthos in this area is high. Sorry, the animals that live on or in the sediment is highly mobile because it's those gravels and sands. So there's not a lot there because it drops off very steeply and it's highly abraded. So when the waves come in, you get that movement all the time. In the wider estuary, however, we do certainly have, and we're preempting probably our next year's presentation on the State of the Environment reports, but we certainly have issues in terms of sediments being probably the major stressor. Our water quality for the entire estuary is actually fairly good. It does its job. We've got some high nutrients coming in, and particularly with phosphorus, which requires some further investigation. But it does its job in terms of a wetland, what a wetland does, which is it actually recycles nutrients, breaks them down, and the water quality is pretty good within the area itself. Sediments, however, are a key stressor. We're seeing a loss of, and this is beyond even ahuriri, we are seeing a loss of some of our sensitive species in our region's estuaries based on those very, very fine sediments starting to take over on the bottom.
Just while
Question
if
three.
you could do indulge me, continue to indulge me. If
This is
going to
supplementary
your
on two.
going to your the image of the Pandora pond itself, are there interventions that we can consider to improve the health of the pond itself, and in particular looking at three features? That feature you've just marked in terms of improving the flow. The other one is beyond the West Shore Bridge and towards the port, that zone there. So if you can comment on any incursion or contamination coming from the boating community there and across the West Shore Bridge itself, and I understand the breach by Napier City in terms of wastewater coming in there, the potential impacts on the quality in that zone.
Sure.
A point of order, Mr. Chairman, we can't because it's outside the terms of reference. Sorry.
You're bringing the council into disrepute.
Carry on, Councillor Curtin, I apologise.
That was just instinctive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So just that feature.
Oh, yes. Okay, so that's a really good question because there has been talk about potentially taking out this little spit. Now, a couple of things there. One is that in really high rainfall events, when the flow is predominantly, when you're getting that contamination off the land and off fields, etc., it actually comes down through the outfit and straight. There's a very, very little amount that will come through there. It's a low hydraulic presence as it comes in. Mostly the pond gets refreshed from the incoming tide coming through there. So taking that spit out could actually do exactly the opposite and expose it to more of those high flow contaminants. In terms of this area here, we did have obviously a paratyphoid outbreak in 2017 where there was several illnesses from mussels collected underneath the boat in a harbour area here. My understanding is that was attributed to human faeces, but based on the location, the presence, etc., it was more likely than not that it would have come from a very localised discharge. And that may be something like a person unlawfully discharging their black water from a boat. There are, we have been working with Napier City Council, because Napier City Council own the land from the Napier Sailing Club. They also have their own berthages here to looking at liveaboard status, where people live on their boats in those marina areas. For the Napier Sailing Club, they have some quite good facilities on site. However, on the Napier City Council berthages over here, there are no facilities for toileting, showering, etc. So liveaboard, where there's no facilities, kind of is a little bit at odds. So they are phasing out, my understanding is they're phasing out their liveaboard permits. There are other techniques that we can look into, which are things like tamper-proof seals, and they can go on the bathrooms, etc., when people are in port. Also dye blocks, which can be used to highlight any unlawful discharges. The difficulty is that it's not unlawful for people to use their bathroom facilities on the boat when they're in port. It's just unlawful for them to discharge it. So some will say that they go off shore to discharge. However, the biofouling on the bottom of the boat does tell a slightly different story.
And just finally, Mr. Chair, the explanation, that's four actually, the explanation of the spike in that period, the last 18-month period, I don't know if we quite got there.
I don't think we have quite got there. There are a number of activities that were occurring. So there were the inflatable that was present within the Napier that domain there, and we have heard from the lifeguards on site that there were a number of unsanitary habits that were being undertaken. However,
you didn't pick up any human though, did you?
We didn't pick up any human, but we didn't fecal source track at that time, because it had gone and passed by that stage. So the fecal source tracking is something we do when we focus on a problem, and we'll go, because you take 5 litres and then you've got to find the result and make sure that it can go. But so at that time there was no fecal source tracking. But then my understanding from Councillor Ormsby is that possibly further up there is also slightly higher E. coli at that point as well from some shellfish surveys. So look, I don't think we have got to an answer. I think it is a watch and see and continue doing what we're doing to try and highlight the issues, and then work with the appropriate authorities, whether it be us, whether it be Napier City Council, to try and mitigate some of those potential sources.
Any other people for questions?
Just one for Anna, thanks. So if we go back to our strategic goals, and it talks about swimmability and contaminant reduction. So, you know, based on these monitoring tools that we have and you've used and you've collected, sort of what actions can be implemented from them to go back to our strategic goals and make improvements there?
Yeah, very good question. And I think one of the key success stories is that actually based on some of our SOE reporting for the 2003 to 2008 year, the council decided on these hotspot projects, which has been an incredible tool for actually being able to put some management interventions in place, be it the fencing, planting, working with people, and even just educating them as to what happens and how to avoid or mitigate it. Obviously, we've got the other side of the coin, which is the consenting and compliance actions. And so the science is just about saying, well, what are going to be, or trying to inform those management approaches.
Just because I note, because I have a close relationship with using it, and my children and most of us, and my husband puts up the Ministry of Health signs to say don't swim here or collect kaimoana. So that's increased, that activity. The activity of cancelling triathlons in Iron Māori is more prominent. Even Optimus yachting gets cancelled because my kids' classes don't go there. So that suggests to me that we're not doing what we should be as well as we should be.
Yeah.
So those are my everyday interactions to suggest we're not improving as we should.
Yeah, and part of the issue will be a much closer focus on the pond. So that closer focus means we are getting calls by Tri Hawke's Bay. We're getting calls by Iron Māori to go out and do some pre-event testing. We've actually taught them how to do pre-event testing now, so they will go out and undertake that as part of their health and safety or their plan for their event. But there is a much closer lens on it in terms of both public perception, public looking at it. The other thing I'll raise is, and I know this because my kids do up yachting as well, unfortunately I don't know that our national guidelines are particularly helpful for users. When it turns amber, what you're saying is there's an elevated potential for health, well, there's elevated potential, go and study further. If you are a teacher or somebody, or a PCBU, somebody in charge of health and safety, does that basically then say, no, we can't do this activity? So I don't think our guidelines are particularly useful in that respect. And in fact, Auckland have changed to simply green and red. Green meaning anything up to the red mark, and they've cut out amber completely. And I know for my school, that was a particular issue, was did they go out when it was under amber status?
Councillor, could I just add just a little context to that as well? I think it's a really good question to ask. The issue is that we're becoming more focused on risk, and Anna's talked a lot about risk and in advising people on risk. Another bit of work the sector's doing with MFE is to say actually the guidelines that we've got to assess risk for this are old, they don't reflect our current knowledge, they don't reflect current science. We want to invest in improving those so that we are better able to inform people of the actual risk. The guidelines right now could be quite conservative and actually the risk overstated, or the other way around. But the more we look, the more we know, the more we tell people, the more focused on those risks we become.
Just an observation, picking up and totally support what Councillor Ormsby's raised there about the need to deal with this problem. The issue, though, is that we're really going to need to drill into that question of causation. And as you said, we're not there yet. Until we know the causes, we can't target the intervention at the right place or at the right activity, or know whether there's anything we can do. So what are the next steps in terms of really drilling down into that question of causation for the spike in the last 2 years' results in particular?
Definitely. So, and part of that, sorry, just going back to the question that was talked about risk, that was also part of what we were hoping the Collieminder may be able to help with, is not overstating the risk, but actually being able to take, you know, as I said, it takes 2 days, then it typically sits on there for a week. Is the risk being accurately described to members using it, and is it useful for them making decisions? And that comes back to a review of the guidelines. Talking about causation, certainly there's two things to that. One is the fecal source tracking will be a huge part of it. The other will be things such as the consents and compliance processes. The other is looking at that measure of success again, because if it is bird faeces and we only ever find bird faeces, do we consider ourselves successful? Because I'd say you'd have to it as a gazetted wildlife refuge.
I've got
I've another question, just a quick question. Those photographs, there are 2 photographs of cows in waterways. Were they recent photos?
They were about a year ago. One was and that is in the Ahuriri, one was a stock fence broken, and that was in that area that I was talking about, and the cows had just happily wandered down to the estuary.
That's the where there's just a few cows grazing on that paddock where there might be.
So it was a broken fence,
Broken fence.
rather than a
one-off.
step.
Yeah, it was a one-off. And
We shouldn't have cows there anyway, that's ridiculous. But what about this other photo?
So this is actually in the upper Ahuriri estuary, and I consider this quite a success story as well, because our technicians who take our water quality samples took this photo, they sent it to me, I ran downstairs to see Andrew Burton, who is our catchment services person who deals with Ahuriri. He got on the phone to the landowner, went to see the landowner, and there was a fence put in place.
Although I think the thing to stress there is it's voluntary action, and until the tank plan change is offered, so tank has got stock exclusion rules included within it, although the National Environmental Standard proposed by the government's current consultations would come in quicker than that, and so stock exclusion will become mandatory. The word of caution, though, on that is that some work which Mr Maxwell was involved with leading for the whole regional sector, looking at swimmability and E. coli, suggests that even if we have extensive amounts of stock exclusion riparian planting, during heavy rainfall events, the overland flow from pastoral farming will still bring large amounts of E. coli to water bodies all over New Zealand. And so the reality is that if we're a country that has ruminant farming extensively in our landscapes, we will always have E. coli following rain. And so the choice for the community here would be, if you really wanted to definitively resolve all of the ruminant sources of E. coli into the Ahuriri estuary, you'd have to look at land use change away from ruminant farming in this catchment, with obviously all the consequences associated with that. So we're stuck with birds permanently, possibly growing, and we're probably stuck with ruminant sources to some extent. So the idea that we can solve this problem is very challenging indeed.
Jeff, did you have one question?
And that's actually the point I wanted to make, is that actually as we become more successful and that estuary will become a wildlife success, we will see that actually that pond possibly won't be used for human recreation. It's through tank we've talked about that, and even if you exclude as much ruminants as you can, it's the wildlife that actually is going to be very prolific there, as Ian has indicated. So, hiding to nowhere almost.
Is that a possibility?
Yes.
As birds become more prolific.
Oh, well, Jeff's saying that, well, we know birds are going to. I mean, the mines will get over that little hurdle. Is it a possibility that Jeff's putting up a supposition that we won't be having any swimming there?
Well, it depends on how the guidelines are set up and how you assess risk. The thing with bird feces is that from a human health perspective, they're very, very low risk relative to ruminants and humans, obviously. So it's a different level of risk. But if we continue with the current approach and the current definition of risk, it'll get worse, because it's going to give a fairly sort of one-size-fits-all approach.
I'll just support what Ian is saying in terms of there's evidence in the US that gull feces is actually quite low infectivity compared to ruminant and cow, and so if the guidelines provided something where we could positively source the fecal bacteria to a particular species or group of species, we may be able to develop a site-specific guideline. Now, one thing, sorry, I forgot to mention when you mentioned about the spit, was that this area is a huge bird roosting area, and actually this year we've had the black-billed gull, which is the rarest gull in the world, 80% decline in numbers over the last 30 years, and they're all happily roosting on their nests, nesting up through here.
Toxins,
And but we haven't seen any exceedances, which is a little bit of a brain twister for me, so I like to wait and watch and say.
Right.
So just a quick point of clarity, Jeff, you mentioned, what's the connection between the success or the progress or otherwise of tank and the swimmability in Pandora?
Because we actually, the whole catchment will have certain restraints on it, even possibly through farm management plans. So what actually now flows in, and we've heard the word phosphorus and nitrogen, now we actually have got an overloading in that estuary, and through the tank process we'll actually see changes in land use behaviour that actually will actually clean up that estuary. And estuary is actually, the estuary, the Ahuriri, to me, apart from Karamu, is one of the most polluted in the whole tank area, and we really focused on that in the tank process.
So the probability of things like Iron Mari being cancelled would probably lessened if there was a successful tank.
New stormwater rules too, management plans.
Short answer is yes, but we might not absolutely eliminate the problem.
Yeah.
I've got 4 questions for you. During the previous discussion we had, it came to our attention that the Napier City Council was doing its own monitoring of the estuary, but we're not giving ours access to the results. Is this still correct or not?
So I'm not sure exactly when you're referring to there. One thing is that they were last year doing monitoring at the Pandora pond as well.
Yep.
We did ask for their results to be able to inform Lawa because they were doing it daily, but there was a reluctance. Now that has changed. We certainly share results quite freely,
Okay.
as far as I'm aware.
All right. The second thing I want to say is that with regard to the spit removal, I'm pleased you mentioned this. Who has authority to make such a decision or to undertake that work? Because I would be alarmed about that. Apart from the blackback gull, I would be alarmed about it. So,
So the spit itself, the land of the spit is under Department of Conservation, and I would say under our resource consenting we would need to be in there as well.
so anybody who's going to do that work would have to come to us and get authority to do that.
Yes, they would.
Well, I'd need a big red flag on that. Any time that hit the deck, we need to know about it.
It's on my radar.
The third thing is mana ahuriri and engagement here. You've touched on briefly about this, but it seems to me that what we've got so far is more the talk about the agencies. What were you doing with mana ahuriri and the committee that got formed for that to make progress in this area?
I've been to Mana Ahuriri twice and done presentations on this. I've also been on a field trip with Mana Ahuriri. We are it is a invitation, so we have a watching brief. I do update them on the work that's going on, probably used to be monthly, it's probably more like about 4 monthly now. So I sent them an email about a month ago just letting them know about the black-billed gulls, about the things that were going on in terms of particularly our Phycopomatus removal, which is the invasive tubeworm removal at the top.
Chair, can I perhaps provide an answer to that? So, Mr. Maxwell referenced before Te Komiti, the agreement in principle that the Crown has with Mana Ahuriri indicates that as part of the treaty settlement yet to come forward in legislation, there would be a statutory committee established for the management of the estuary, involving Mana Ahuriri, but also Napier City Council, Hastings District Council, Department of Conservation and ourselves. That committee has met several times informally, but has not yet been constituted under any legal framework, and that is owing to the fact that the Mana Ahuriri treaty settlement is currently stalled through a Waitangi Tribunal appeal process. And it's fair to say that the committee is not getting up and running because of that outstanding set of issues in relation to their treaty settlement. So we've been a little bit caught, so we've been trying not to get too far ahead of that committee and that process with our work and with Napier City Council, although I think that the last few months the view has started to develop that we probably just need to get on, given that Mana Ahuriri are somewhat distracted and that the treaty settlement might take some time to be completed.
Okay. The fourth one is, you talked about the red, amber, green, and how Auckland Council has a red and green. And what I'd like you to do, should we consider doing exactly the same thing? Because I agree with your assessment. Most people see an amber as actually a red. Yeah. It's pointless. I think we should look at either safe, not safe. So could we have a think about that and see if we could change our traffic light?
Yeah, absolutely, we can look at it. Certainly something that should be considered on the regional sector, particularly with things like Lawa. Auckland have gone and done it, particularly because theirs is based on models, and they do have another one which is black, which means raw sewage has been discharged. So they still have they have a green, they have a red, and then they have a black. We would absolutely need to do that in consultation with the Public Health Unit and make an agreement there.
And the broader sector, and Chair, I just note that Auckland Council spent several $1 million in developing hydrodynamic models to be able to create that sort of solution. So we'd want to just have eyes wide open around how we proceed with that.
Well, we have some discussion about that, because I just think this notion of having a red, be cautious, no go, just isn't true. It's go, or one moment it's amber, people don't use it. So we actually de facto have a red, green traffic light.
I do somewhat agree. I think the only time that I've been able to make any sense of it is if you are prone to illness, if you have a particular underlying condition, you may choose then not to go in the water. But again, it's probably not useful for a large majority of people. The other thing to understand about the models that are undertaken in Auckland and the Porirua Harbour, which use the same water quality models for trying to predict these exceedances, is that they are predominantly influenced by infrastructure failures. So they can actually very clearly define times where it is unsuitable for swimming. We are predominantly influenced by diffuse sources, and it is certainly nowhere near as clear. We have looked at turbidity as a correlate, we've looked at salinity, we've looked at flows, and nothing is coming up to us that we can use as a predictor for being able to alert people, apart from rain. and again, that works in some areas and doesn't work particularly well. Pandora Pond, we have 22 mil of rain, it never exceeded. We have 5 mil of rain, it exceeds. So there is a lot to consider there, and we've heard about the modelling and how useful it may be, but for Hawke's Bay, we have struggled to be able to form an argument around that.
Good. Just last thing before we go, the other thing I want to come back to is that I enjoyed your report and read your paper, but I think what's missing here from, as I sense it from councillors, is to pick up on the word that Councillor Williams used, drilling. So we've got a report in here, but I think people want to know where we go to from here, what are the steps. So could I ask, or maybe put in the resolution, as a consequence of this, that we get not necessarily a big report, maybe just an email, for you to outline to where do you see the next steps being, you know, what the analysis is doing, what are we going to do, where does this take us to? I think we need to have a sense of where this is going to the next, council need to have a feel of where this is going to for the next step.
Is that a question, was it?
Yeah.
No, just as a summing up.
I'm happy to move the paper, Mr. Chair.
Councillor.
I'm happy to second.
Councillor Curtin, seconded.
You want to speak?
Well, I will speak very briefly.
You will speak.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, before Councillor Curtin speaks, I need to submit an apology, particularly to the team for the next agenda. I'm chair of the Board of Trustees of Woodford House. I've got to go to the prize giving this minute. That's been a fantastic presentation. This is an important issue to me. The next issue is a really important issue to me. I will be watching the video. I do hope we come back to Right Tree, Right Farm in our strategic discussion. I also want to talk about the letter from Federated Farmers. I'm very concerned about the DIN limit and had asked that that issue be on the agenda here. I think we could probably deal with it in the strategic session. If that could be accommodated in some respect when I come back to the strategic committee, I apologise to you people, I have to go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that indulgence.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
You're indulged.
You look very elegant today, mate.
Oh, thank you.
Now we know.
I wonder why the cufflinks are on.
That's because my shirt requires them.
Councillor Curtin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, echoing comments from the Chair, this entire topic and our inputs into it are really, really important to us, and I look forward to the next snapshot, and it is just that. This is one consideration of the Pandora Pond itself, which is part of a much broader ecosystem up there that which we have a great deal of interest in. I just want to, Mr. Chair, go to the broader issues here for Council, particularly in regard to our new Council, is the importance of our science team and the inputs that across the board that our science effort is providing for the organisation. From my experience, we have an excellent science team and science outputs right across the board, and what also from my experience is that the entire effort should underpin everything we do. Evidence base is where this organisation should be. I can assure you, new councillors, that our science team does not gild the lily. They say it how it is and give us real data, real evidence. And the more we drill down to it, the more you appreciate that. But this traverses not only our coastal marine environment, right across the board, our knowledge and understanding and science base, when we look at our water systems, for example, the investments we're making in LIDAR and other evidence producing outputs is where we should be. If we're looking for an investment, we ought to be continuing to invest in our science outputs, and I have no hesitation in saying that. The same with the paper we're looking at later today, Mr. Chair, around our forestry and our land management issues. Again, the science should be overwhelming and compelling in determining our strategic direction. No hesitation in affirming the receipt of this report.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks, Anna. So I've been here for, I don't know, 6 years now, and you always give these wonderful reports about the estuary. I sense the Chair is a little bit frustrated too, and it's no one's fault, it's just the complexity of what is happening in this estuary. but we do need to get on with it. And I think I said to you a year ago or 18 months ago, you know, what do you think we should do? You know, and that little list of one-page list of what do we have to do here, because otherwise we'll be sitting here. I won't be, but other council will be sitting here for another 6 years, and we'll still be saying, you know, causation. I'm sorry that the council had to leave, because I'm pretty. Your report, we're pretty clear what's happening here. We've got sheep and cow feces. We've got the Thames time confluence there, and we've got those legacy issues in that industrial area. So we've got a whole lot of legacy issues, and if you go onto our website, you find an old map of the drains coming out of Napier, and it's pretty horrendous, really. You know, all these red lines over the map going into our streams and waterways in the estuary. So, you know, we do need to start getting on with it. And I know, as our chief executive said that it's tied up in tank, so we do need to get on with tank, so that we can actually make some rules and regulations around this, because in the final analysis, our population's just not going to stand for it. You know, they've waited and waited, and they elect us here, and they depend on us to make decent decisions and fix these things. And they are probably a little bit irrationally impatient, but I think that impatience is going to increase, and you know, and in fairness to them, it's spiked the last 2 years. So, you know, I've been sitting here 6 years and it's got worse. And that really concerns me personally. So we've got to work with Manaharu. We have the issues that they haven't managed to settle their treaty, because we did think that was going to be the vehicle that we were going to be able to use. But that's fallen away, so I agree with James. We've just got to get on with it. But we've got to get on with it. When I fly out of here quite often and fly north, and I look at all those hills and cliffs, and there's still not a lot of trees. There's a few, but not enough. So somehow we've got to get Rick's one-page list of what are the things, so we can start getting on with it. We've got to fix it.
Next speaker. Well, I'll just a couple of things. Thank you, Anna, for another great presentation. Rex is right; they always give good presentations, and it's good to be entertained and promoted and shoved around as well as informed. Rex is also onto it about the issue about that one page of what do you want to do. I mean, people want to do things. I don't know whether it's just a bloke thing or just a frustration, but people do want to do things. And it's because it's such a special place, and Neil is always hammered that it's such a special place. The fact is, though, that it is only a remnant of what was there, an absolute remnant, and that's why DOC is so focused on it. Because when you look at wetlands along the coast for migratory birds, there are very few. There's this one here, and this for DOC is incredibly special, and they focus on it very, 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 very carefully, and they've been right. My feeling is that the number of birds in the area has gone up significantly, and it's going to continue to grow. This is a good thing. And Giraffe is also right in that when the bird life goes up, it's going to put more and more pressure on what we do as humans in that area. It's really interesting to see in Wellington that the Wellington City Council is chopping down a tree because the shags are roosting on it, and the locals don't like the smell. So, because they don't like the smell of the shags, the tree goes, so the shags have to go. Well, I thought that was a terrible decision. We have to make sure that we leave a space for the birds because that's their place. And so we're going to have a pressure from people about what they want to do themselves and for the birds. Now that's a place we've taken almost all the rest of it. So we've got to make sure we maintain this place for the birds as a sanctuary and as best we can make it usable for us in terms of Pandora. But we need things to do. People are frustrated. So we'd welcome an outline to you, from you of what it is, the pathway forward, the drilling, the analysis, the work, whatever. If things we can do voluntarily, I accept James's point. Much better to have tank, but the things we can do voluntarily is go and ask the questions of people. We need something to go forward from on here. But thank you. All right. You want to close? Okay, put the question. All those in favour, receiving the report, say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Carried. I look at the time and see it's 10:25. We've got quite a big problem, issue coming up next on Right Tree, Right Place.
Smoko.
So a very good suggestion, Councillor Graham. It's always first out to talk about smoko. I like this.
The union, mate.
Yes, that's all right.
The
So we'll
delegate
stand. We'll
The
leave the
delegate
meeting
today.
from now. We'll be back at 22.